In 1998, survival horror's rise to popularity was just beginning. An original Resident Evil 2, released January that year, could have been the game to bring the genre truly widespread attention. Featuring more refined controls and mechanics over the original Resident Evil, better visuals, more bombastic adventure story with a destroyed city, torn family, evil corporation and super mercenary spies, and 4 distinct story campaigns across 2 playable characters, it was quick to become a favorite of many people. It was a surprise even to Capcom, who had to scrap the original version of the game in development, now usually known as Resident Evil 1.5, and redo almost everything. Several years later, an exclusivity contract with Nintendo led to Resident Evil 2002, colloquially known as Remake or Remake, and a lot of people started to expect all of the classic trilogy to get a similar treatment. It was not to be, but fans did not stop requesting until in 2015, Capcom announced their plans to remake Resident Evil 2 with a "We Do It." 3 years have passed since that surprise announcement.
Resident Evil 2.
This is what survival horror is. For the first time in 15 years, after 2 close but somewhat flawed attempts at the genre by Resident Evil 7 and Alien Isolation, we get a game that fully embraces its legacy. This is an action-adventure with heavy focus on resource management with ammo, healing and returning from remake defense items in short supply, huge focus on exploration in an interconnected world, just like Metroidvanias, and yes, just like Dark Souls. There's some puzzle solving and enemies are designed to work against and in favor of your limitations, and it's beautiful. If you're all about exploring interesting game worlds and finding new, preferably safer paths to the already explored areas, you will be delighted to know that the new Resident Evil 2 is even more interconnected than the original game, and a lot of its areas are expanded in smart ways. It's bigger on the map, but due to the character speed, the controls and the natural room-to-room transitioning, it feels about as big as it used to be. And there are some welcome additions, often based around the ideas that were planned to the original game and 1.5, but couldn't be implemented back then. Puzzles are more fun to figure out and stay consistent like all item placement for enhancing replayability. You can continuously find better and more efficient ways to play the game the more you play it. Your first playthrough of one campaign might take 7 hours, but you can make that an hour or less after playing the game more, and just like with the originals, this focus on making the game fun not to just play once but to replay is what makes it exciting. The combat had to be slightly refocused with the switch to over-the-shoulder camera, but I'm happy to see that Capcom nailed it as well. Your placement, movement and weapon usage is still important to the situation, while limited resources, unpredictable enemy movement and their damage resistance make it important to know where to shoot and when, as it is when to run and avoid combat completely. Enemies are extremely fun to play around, with all of them having distinct quirks to remember, all reminiscent of the ideas from the original, but again smartly expanded upon. What has also been expanded upon are character personalities and stories, however somehow this led to a more muddy and muted narrative. It's bizarre, but despite having more nuance and more interesting scenes, the overall story ends up feeling a bit of a confused mess without a distinct tone or style, something that the original game had in spades. And it left me questioning whenever I would have liked or cared about the characters and events as much if I didn't have the knowledge of the series. Also lacking is the music. I wouldn't have brought this up, given how this approach with no music for most of the game but the cutscenes, which in turn usually have boring cinematic orchestral scores, have been the bane of the series for 10 years. But there are 2 things to note. First off, this game has several standout tracks that aren't just good like some of the themes in recent titles, but might be some of the best in the entire series, though I've pretty much used all of them in this video. And secondly, if you enable the option to play with the original soundtrack, which is unfortunately a paid DLC, not a free option, that music fits the gameplay really well majority of time, completely busting the idea that the old type of approach to music in games can ruin the mood of game or gameplay. So hopefully Capcom will rethink the approach in future and we will have more memorable tunes, at least as an option. But if music might not be an objective downgrade, the way the story scenarios conflict with each other this time around most certainly is. While I was fully supportive of the announced intention to remove the whole Scenario A, Scenario B concept of the original that netted you 4 distinct stories in favor of just one scenario per character that complement each other, netting you 2 distinct stories, Capcom seemed to have not been able to come through with this plan. It feels like a late development change or a location cut, but the ending act of the game for both characters, independently of the new game or new game second run mode, is basically exactly the same up until the final boss, which leads to the exact same locations being broken in conflicting ways and having same characters die completely differently in a story that is supposedly canon and true for both playthroughs, which pretty much discards the main defining feature of the original this game is remaking. But that's a huge fan of the series in me complaining, because the new Resident Evil 2 somehow manages to be an amazing yet irreparably flawed and disappointing remake of the original. I mean, this is survival horror at its best, revived and evolved for 2019, but it doesn't stop me from thinking that should this kind of remake have been released in 2005, fans like me would have met it with less excitement. Distancing myself from a fanboy inside, however, makes this game an easy recommendation. This is one of the most exciting titles I've played in a very long time. I love playing and replaying the game, I like the bonus games and all the new stuff that they added, I love playing different modes and with different fun unlocks, and despite clocking more than 40 hours in it already, I'm yet to be bored, unlike what usually happens with games that actually require 40 hours to complete them once. If you're new to the series, to survival horror, or to exploration of intricate environments, new Resident Evil 2 is a great way to start. And if you're a fan already, well, you're in for quite a treat. It looks like this party has not been cancelled.
This is Nighthawk. Come in, Alpha. Alpha, do you read? Man, I thought you were all wiped out. I've been trying to... Guess there's no keeping down the Grim Reaper, huh? Relax, Mr. Reaper. I'm headed toward the front gate of RPD. Pick you up there.